In 1990, the person who murdered a 22-year-old woman left behind an almost invisible impression in a bloodstain at the crime scene. At the time, the mark appeared too faint and distorted to identify, but a new form of computer-based forensic imaging would later uncover distinct ridge characteristics hidden within the smear, evidence that would lead investigators directly to the killer. The case began in Richmond, Virginia. Richmond is a city deeply connected to its history. Once the capital of the Confederacy, it is also home to several colleges and universities, drawing thousands of young students to the area every year. One of those students was 22-year-old Dawn Bruce, who had attended Virginia Commonwealth University. Dawn was a talented musician. After successfully completing an audition, she earned a place in the VCU Wind Symphony. Music was one of the main reasons she remained at the university for as long as she did. But Dawn was also eager to discover what life beyond college might offer. She wanted to test herself in the real world and find out what she was capable of achieving. After leaving college, Dawn worked as a telephone operator during the day and as a waitress at night. The hours were long, but she enjoyed the independence that came with living on her own. Her family remembered her as adventurous, confident, and determined to live life on her own terms.
Dawn was fun-loving kind of person. Thought she could do anything and everything, and didn't care what other people said about her trying to do things that weren't the norm.
She was also working toward another goal. Dawn wanted to become a firefighter. She had completed firefighter IN3 training and was volunteering with a local fire department. Her family believed she had an entire future ahead of her, a career, marriage, children, and countless experiences still waiting for her. But that future was taken from her. On the 19th of December, 1990, Dawn's mother went to her daughter's apartment after becoming concerned that she had not heard from her for several days. When she entered the apartment, she discovered Dawn lying in a pool of blood. Investigators arrived and immediately recognized the brutality of the crime. The medical examiner found evidence that Dawn had been sexually assaulted and stabbed directly in the heart. The fatal wound had been inflicted with a knife. According to investigators, the attacker drove the blade into Dawn's heart and held her down while she slowly bled to death. The dying process may have lasted 8 to 10 minutes, or possibly even longer. One investigator later described the scene as one of the most disturbing cases he had ever encountered.
First impression I had was what a horrible, horrible crime, and what somebody had done to really an innocent young lady who absolutely didn't deserve what happened to her in any sense of the word.
Dawn had been asleep when the attack began. She was a 22-year-old woman who was working, living independently, and preparing for the future. Instead, she was subjected to a prolonged and deeply personal act of violence inside her own home. Investigators examined the apartment for signs of entry. They discovered that someone had pried open a window and entered through it, but the scene did not resemble a burglary. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. Furniture had not been overturned. The apartment had not been ransacked. There were no obvious foreign fingerprints inside the residence. The attacker appeared to have entered for one specific purpose. When the crime scene team completed its initial search, there was remarkably little evidence to remove from the apartment. Most of the collected items came from the bed, the sheets, the pillows, the pillowcases, and the blankets. There was no murder weapon. There were no eyewitnesses, and there were very few immediate leads. From the beginning, investigators feared this would be an extremely difficult case to solve. Dawn had last been seen 2 nights earlier at Tommy's restaurant, where she worked the night shift as a waitress. Because of her job, she regularly interacted with customers, co-workers, and strangers. That created a large pool of people investigators might need to examine. Detectives Tom Tiller and Jim Dorton began interviewing residents of Dawn's apartment complex. Several neighbors immediately attracted their attention. One man lived directly beside Dawn. He was on active parole for burglary. An attempted rape committed while armed with a knife. Given the circumstances of Dawn's death, investigators considered him a strong initial suspect. His criminal history contained disturbing similarities: burglary, sexual violence, and the use of a knife. But suspicion was not evidence. Detectives still had to determine whether anything physically connected him to Dawn's apartment or the attack. At that point, they had almost nothing. No weapon, no witness, no clear fingerprints, no obvious motive. One investigator later recalled, leaving the apartment with a deeply pessimistic feeling. The crime had been extraordinarily violent, yet the killer had left behind very little investigators could immediately use. It appeared that Dawn's murder might become one of those cases in which police knew a dangerous person was responsible, but lacked the evidence necessary to identify him. The investigation would depend on the few physical traces still hidden inside the apartment, and one of those traces was so faint that investigators could barely see it. Shortly after the rape and murder of 22-year-old Dawn Bruce, prosecutor John Alderman was assigned to the case. For Alderman, the brutality of the attack created an immediate sense of outrage.
When you get a crime like this that really violates a person, you get a sense of indignation that's impossible to escape.
With no witnesses, no murder weapon, and no obvious suspect, investigators began focusing on the limited physical evidence recovered from Dawn's apartment. The medical examiner determined that Dawn had suffered a single fatal stab wound directly to the heart. In the forensic laboratory, scientists examined the bedding collected from the crime scene on one pillowcase. They found 2 straight impressions consistent with the sides of a knife blade. The pattern suggested that the weapon may have been a serrated hunting knife, but the pillowcase contained something even more important. In Dawn's blood, investigators could see what appeared to be part of a fingerprint. It was nearly invisible. The impression had been deposited on textured fabric, and the weave of the pillowcase distorted the ridge patterns. Even trained fingerprint examiners had difficulty seeing useful detail.
The ridge detail was very faint, and we had to really study it because as we studied it under magnification, you enlarged the fabric weave, which had a tendency to totally eradicate the ridge detail. So at that point...
At the time, examiners had little confidence that the print could ever be identified. There appeared to be some ridge detail, but not enough for a reliable comparison. Unless investigators found additional evidence, the bloody impression might remain visible but unusable. Traces of semen were also recovered from the victim. Serological testing indicated that the attacker had type A blood. That result allowed investigators to eliminate some of the early suspects. Dawn's boyfriend did not have type A blood. Neither did the neighbor who was on parole for burglary and attempted rape, although that neighbor's criminal history had initially made him appear suspicious. The biological evidence did not match him. Investigators then began examining another resident of the apartment complex, Robert Knight. Knight had previously been arrested for drug possession. More importantly, investigators learned that he had made sexually suggestive comments to Dawn. He reportedly spoke to her while she was washing her car or walking between her apartment and vehicle. The comments were inappropriate enough that detectives began considering him a serious suspect. Robert Knight also had type A blood, making him consistent with the semen evidence recovered from the crime scene. But Knight claimed to have an alibi. He said he had spent the night with his girlfriend, and at first, the partial fingerprint on the pillowcase did not appear to match the fingerprint records police already had for him. The problem was not necessarily that the prints were different. The bloody impression was simply too faint and distorted to make a reliable comparison. Forensic specialists attempted to improve the print using traditional photography. They adjusted the lighting and contrast, hoping to separate the fingerprint ridges from the woven pillowcase pattern. Nothing worked. Scientists also tried several chemical processes, but each time they enhanced the blood impression, they also enhanced the threads beneath it. The weave became more visible at the same time as the fingerprint, making the ridge details just as difficult to interpret. Investigators knew the print existed. They could see it. As Alderman later explained, the fingerprint was trapped inside an extremely difficult medium, blood deposited on patterned fabric.
The fingerprint was something that we knew we had. It clearly was observed, it clearly was seen, but no one knew what to do with it because it was in a medium, in blood, on a medium, on a pillowcase, against a pattern of the pillowcase that made it unreadable.
The frustration was enormous. If investigators could somehow make the print readable, it might become as persuasive as DNA evidence. But until then, it was only a clue without a name. Paulus continued examining Robert Knight. His alibi began to weaken. Knight said he had been with his girlfriend throughout the night Dawn was murdered. But when detectives interviewed the girlfriend, she contradicted him. Investigators believe the crime occurred sometime between approximately 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock on Saturday morning. Knight's girlfriend said he had not been with her during that critical period. That left him without a confirmed alibi at the estimated time of the murder. His behavior toward investigators also began to change. At first, Knight had appeared willing to cooperate, but as detectives continued returning to question him, he became increasingly distant and defensive. He accused police of harassing him. He said he no longer wanted investigators coming around. To detectives, the change was noticeable. Still, suspicious behavior was not enough to prove murder. Investigators compared the bloody print with the fingerprints already on file for Robert Knight. But those records did not contain enough clear ridge detail. in the relevant area of his thumb. Knight voluntarily provided another set of fingerprints. Once again, the impressions were not clear enough for a conclusive comparison. This created a serious problem for prosecutors. If they took the case to trial without identifying the bloody print, the defense could argue that it belonged to the real killer. A defense attorney could simply ask, whose fingerprint was found in Dawn Bruce's blood? If prosecutors answered that they did not know, the defense could claim that the unidentified print excluded Robert Knight. A single unanswered question could undermine the entire case. As Alderman explained,
in our line of work, you really need to answer all the questions, and if you don't, the defense attorney asks those questions at closing arguments.
Investigators needed to determine whether the print belonged to Knight, but every conventional method had failed. Then, during a statewide conference for latent fingerprint examiners, investigators learned about an unfamiliar computer system. It had never been used in a forensic case like this, and no one knew whether a court would accept its results. But the investigators had almost nothing else, so they decided it was worth trying. The system was known as image enhancement technology. It offered a possibility that traditional photography and chemical processing could not. The computer might be able to identify the woven pattern of the pillowcase and digitally subtract it from the image. If it worked, the fabric could effectively disappear, leaving only the bloody fingerprint behind. Every year, latent print examiners from across Virginia attended a statewide training conference. At one of these conferences, a vendor demonstrated a new computer-based imaging system. The technology was designed to enhance faint or obscured evidence by identifying unwanted visual patterns and digitally removing them from an image. Investigators were skeptical. The system had never been used in a forensic case like Dawn Bruce's murder, and no one knew whether its results would ultimately be accepted in court. But traditional photography and chemical enhancement had already failed. The bloody impression on the pillowcase was the best clue they had, so they decided to try. The process became known as digital image enhancement. First, technicians created a high-quality image of the blood-stained pillowcase. The computer then analyzed the repeating pattern of the fabric. The pillowcase contained two separate sources of visual interference: the printed surface pattern and the woven threads beneath it. Both were obscuring the fingerprint ridges. The system identified those regular patterns and began subtracting them from the image. It did not invent new information. It did not redraw or reconstruct the fingerprint. It simply reduced the visual background that prevented examiners from seeing the impression clearly. The work was slow and careful. After approximately 10 hours of processing and testing, the fabric pattern began to fade from the image. Then the weave was reduced. What remained started to look very different. The nearly invisible smear gradually revealed the ridge details of a partial fingerprint. More specifically, investigators believed it was part of the killer's thumbprint. For the first time since Dawn's murder, they had a realistic chance of identifying the person who had left blood on the pillowcase. By then, Robert Knight remained the investigation's primary suspect. He had type of blood consistent with the biological evidence recovered from the crime scene. He had previously made sexually suggestive comments to Dawn, and the girlfriend who supported his alibi acknowledged that he had not been with her during the critical period between approximately 3 o'clock and 4 a.m., but prosecutors still faced a major obstacle. The fingerprints already available for Knight were not clear enough in the specific area needed for comparison. Knight voluntarily provided a second set of prints. Once again, the relevant ridge detail was insufficient. Investigators could see the bloody print on the pillowcase more clearly than ever, but they still did not have a suitable known print from Knight with which to compare it. At the same time, Knight became less cooperative. Whenever investigators appeared near him, he grew increasingly distant and confrontational. He accused them of harassment and made it clear that he no longer wanted to assist the investigation. The prosecution now faced a difficult decision. Knight was their strongest suspect, but without identifying the bloody fingerprint, a defense attorney could use it to create reasonable doubt. The defense could argue that the print belonged to the real killer, and that prosecutors had arrested the wrong man. Despite that risk, investigators and prosecutors decided to move forward. Robert Knight was arrested for the murder of Dawn Bruce. Their case was still largely circumstantial. Their hopes now depended on obtaining a much clearer set of Knight's fingerprints and determining whether one of them matched the enhanced print on the pillowcase. After the arrest, fingerprint examiner Norm Tiller carefully observed the booking process. He wanted to ensure that every finger was rolled properly from one side of the nail to the other, producing the clearest possible impressions. This time, the process worked. As soon as Tiller saw a suitable rolled print, he took it back to his office and began the comparison. He did not rush. The stakes were too high. A mistaken identification could destroy the prosecution's case and falsely implicate a man in murder. Tiller examined the enhanced crime scene print against Knight's newly recorded fingerprints. He studied the ridge formations from multiple angles. He repeated the comparison. Then he repeated it again. The process lasted approximately 1 month. Finally, Tiller reached a conclusion. The bloody impression on Dawn Bruce's pillowcase was part of a left thumbprint, and it matched the outer portion of Robert Knight's left thumb.
I spent additional time doing comparison work and just analyzing the print from every angle, so to speak, before we actually affected the identification. And even then, I had another examiner go behind me and take a look at everything that I had done to make sure there were no errors made in the process.
For investigators, this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The faint smear that once appeared almost useless had now placed Robert Knight directly in Dawn's blood, but identifying the fingerprint did not immediately solve every problem. The image enhancement process was so new that it had never been tested in court in this way. No judge had yet ruled on whether evidence produced through this method met the required scientific standards. Prosecutors worried that the defense might convince the court that the computer had altered the original fingerprint. If the enhanced image were excluded, one of the strongest pieces of evidence against Knight could disappear before the trial even began. A special hearing was scheduled to determine whether the technology, and the fingerprint produced through it, could be presented to a jury. The prosecution now had to prove not only that the print belonged to Robert Knight, but that the computer had revealed the evidence without changing it. The enhanced thumbprint appeared to match Robert Knight, but before prosecutors could present it to a jury, they faced a completely different challenge. Would the court accept the new technology as reliable forensic science? Digital image enhancement had never before been used in this way in a criminal trial. The defense was expected to argue that the computer had altered the original evidence, or even created details that were not present in the bloody impression. Prosecutors therefore had to demonstrate exactly how the process worked. A special hearing was held to determine whether the enhanced fingerprint could be admitted as evidence. During the hearing, specialists explained that the computer did not redraw, reshape, or reconstruct the fingerprint. The original evidence remained unchanged. What the system removed was the visual interference created by the pillowcase. First, the printed pattern on the fabric was identified and reduced. Then the weave of the material was isolated and subtracted from the image. At every stage, the fingerprint ridges remained in the same position. The lines did not move, the grooves did not change. No new ridge characteristics were added. The system simply made existing details easier to see. One expert explained that the procedure could be repeated as many times as necessary and would continue producing the same result. That repeatability was essential. It showed that the enhanced image was not based on guesswork or subjective interpretation. The demonstration allowed the judge to observe the enhancement process step by step. As the fabric pattern gradually disappeared, the bloody fingerprint remained. The ridge details did not shift or change for prosecutors. This visual demonstration became the most persuasive part of the hearing. It showed that the computer had not created a fingerprint. It had uncovered one that was already there. The judge ultimately ruled that the enhancement process was scientifically reliable and that the bloody thumbprint could be presented in court. The decision established an important legal precedent. For the first time, this form of computer-enhanced fingerprint evidence had survived a direct courtroom challenge. Even with the fingerprint admitted, prosecutors wanted more evidence before taking the case to trial. The print connected Robert Knight to Dawn's bloodstained pillowcase, but the prosecution also wanted biological evidence tying him directly to the sexual assault. The semen recovered from the crime scene was submitted for DNA testing. The result provided the confirmation investigators had been seeking. The DNA profile from the semen matched Robert Knight. Paulus now had two powerful forensic links: Knight's left thumbprint in Dawn's blood, and his DNA and biological evidence recovered from the scene. The case that had once appeared nearly impossible to solve had become one of the strongest forensic cases the prosecutor had ever handled. Investigators reconstructed what they believed happened. Sometime around 4 o'clock in the morning, Robert Knight approached the front window of Dawn's apartment. He pried it open and entered the residence. Dawn was asleep. The evidence indicated that Knight sexually assaulted her and then stabbed her directly in the heart. The bloody thumbprint was left on the pillowcase during the attack. Knight had entered Dawn's home without permission. Nothing was stolen. The evidence suggested that burglary had never been his purpose. Faced with the fingerprint identification, the DNA match, and the possibility of receiving the death penalty, Robert Douglas Knight chose not to proceed to trial. He pleaded guilty to Dawn Bruce's murder. Knight was sentenced to 4 life terms in prison. For Dawn's family, the plea brought legal resolution. But it did not erase their anger over what had happened. Some believed that 4 life sentences were not enough and that Knight deserved the death penalty. His own investigator expressed the same frustration, saying that although justice had been served, he believed the brutality of the crime warranted the harshest possible punishment. The prosecutor later reflected on how dramatically the case had changed. When Robert Knight was first arrested, the evidence against him was largely circumstantial. Investigators had a suspicious neighbor, a weakened alibi type of blood, and a nearly unreadable mark on a pillowcase. But forensic science transformed the investigation.
When we arrested Knight, we had a bare circumstantial case. That's all we had. And it went to being the absolutely strongest forensic case I've ever prosecuted in 24 years.
The case could not have been solved through interviews alone. Knight did not confess during the investigation. There were no eyewitnesses. The murder weapon was never recovered. The decisive evidence came from the crime scene itself. A faint bloody thumbprint, hidden beneath the texture of a pillowcase, and biological evidence that later produced a DNA match. For Dawn's mother, however, the case was never simply about evidence or courtroom precedent. It was about the daughter she had lost. Dawn had been energetic, independent, and determined to experience as much of life as possible. She wanted a career. She hoped to become a firefighter. She may eventually have married and had children. None of that was allowed to happen. Years later, Dawn's mother spoke with her other daughter about the fear of having children, and then losing them. Her response was simple. Even if she had known in advance that Dawn would one day be murdered, she still would have chosen to have her. Because Dawn had brought so much happiness to their family, life could never be guaranteed, but the possibility of loss did not make that life, or the love surrounding it, any less valuable, and the nearly invisible impression Dawn's killer left behind ensured that despite his attempt to disappear without a trace, he would ultimately be identified. In 1981, 6-year-old Cassie Hansen disappeared during an evening church service. There were no eyewitnesses. No one could explain how she had vanished, and investigators had almost nothing that could point them toward a suspect. The most significant piece of physical evidence was a single strand of hair. It was not an ordinary hair. Forensic examination revealed rare and unusual characteristics, including distinctive features in its cuticle, the outermost layer of the hair shaft. Because those features were uncommon, the strand became the most valuable physical clue in the investigation. In a case with no direct witnesses, the hair provided investigators with something objective that could be examined, compared, and presented in court. Its forensic importance proved critical in building the case against Stuart Knowlton. The hair evidence helped investigators connect Knowlton to Cassie's disappearance and gave prosecutors the physical support they needed to move forward. Knowlton was ultimately found guilty of first-degree murder and an additional second-degree misconduct offense. He was sentenced to life in prison. The case demonstrated how even the smallest trace of physical evidence can become decisive when a crime leaves investigators with almost nothing else. A single strand of unusually structured hair helped provide the link that eyewitness testimony could not. But the original transcript provides only a brief summary of the Cassie Hansen case before abruptly transitioning into a different cold case narrative. To avoid inventing details not contained in the source, this chapter preserves only the information clearly supported by the manuscript. The manuscript then shifts to another cold case, one centered on a woman named Emily Carter, a forgotten fingerprint, and a disappearance that had remained unsolved for decades. The fingerprint should not have survived. It had been recovered from the outside of the driver's side window of Emily's car. Investigators initially believed it had been left by Michael Carter, whose fingerprints were already known to police. But there was a serious problem with that explanation. Vehicle maintenance records showed that Emily's car had been taken to a repair shop on the 3rd of October, 18 days before she disappeared. The transmission had been repaired, and Emily had continued driving the car every day afterward. During those 18 days, the vehicle had been exposed to rain, dust, repeated use, and possibly car washes. A fingerprint left on the outside of the driver's window before the repair should not have remained clear enough to survive all of that. Unless it had not been left 18 days earlier. Unless it had been placed there on the night Emily vanished. Detective Daniel Mercer slowly closed the file. Outside his office window, church bells echoed across Black Ridge County. Children hurried towards school buses. Neighbors waved to one another across quiet streets. No one knew that a forgotten fingerprint had just reopened the county's oldest mystery. And across town, Michael Carter began another ordinary morning, unaware that the first crack had appeared in a story he had protected for decades. Daniel drove toward Michael's farmhouse without activating his emergency lights. He wanted information before confrontation. The property sat beyond miles of harvested cornfields. Morning fog clung to the ground, reducing fence posts and trees to dark silhouettes. Daniel parked some distance away and watched. At approximately 8:17 a.m., Michael stepped onto the porch carrying a cup of coffee. He appeared exactly as he had during every memorial service and anniversary connected to Emily's disappearance, calm, respectful, and completely ordinary. After a few moments, he went back inside. Nothing about his behavior was unusual, but Daniel was no longer looking for something dramatic. He was looking for inconsistency. Back at the forensic laboratory, Ava continued examining the original evidence with modern imaging technology. High-resolution scans revealed something investigators had failed to notice in 1994. Michael's partial fingerprint overlapped another impression. The second print was faint and incomplete, too fragmented to identify, but it proved something important. Two different people had touched the driver's window within a relatively short period of time. Daniel spread the enlarged images across the table. The case was no longer as simple as the original investigators had believed. Ava studied the overlapping impressions. Maybe it never was. The team reopened every witness interview conducted after Emily disappeared. One statement immediately caught Daniel's attention. An elderly gas station clerk had reported seeing Emily's sedan near Miller Bridge at approximately 9:40 p.m. The original investigators had dismissed the account because it did not fit their accepted timeline. Daniel was no longer willing to dismiss it. He drove to the old gas station that afternoon. The business had been abandoned for years, but its former owner, Walter Jennings, still lived nearby. Walter's memory had faded with age, yet one detail remained surprisingly clear. "I remember the headlights," he said. "They stayed on." Daniel leaned forward. "Was anyone else there?" Walter closed his eyes, trying to return to that night. "I couldn't see any faces." He paused. "But I remember hearing 2 car doors close." The original report mentioned only one vehicle. Walter insisted he had heard 2. If he was right, Emily had not been alone. Someone may have met her near Miller Bridge that night. Someone investigators had never identified. Daniel thanked Walter and returned to his car. Before he could start the engine, Ava called, "You need to come back." What happened? "We found something inside the evidence box." Among the old materials was a roll of undeveloped film. Most of the images were useless. Then one photograph stopped Daniel cold. It showed a vehicle with the same make, color, and damaged taillight as a car registered to Michael Carter in October 1994. The fingerprint, Walter's memory of 2 car doors. And now the photograph. Each piece meant little on its own. Together, they suggested that Michael's vehicle may have been near the location where Emily was last seen. Before Daniel could say anything, the office telephone rang. A quiet male voice spoke on the other end. "You found the film." Daniel's expression tightened. "Who is this?" The caller ignored the question. "You've been looking at the wrong night." A long silence followed. Then the caller gave one final instruction: go back to October 20th. The line went dead. Emily had disappeared on the 21st of October, 1994. Why would the caller direct investigators to the previous day? Daniel reopened the original case file. For the first time, he stopped focusing only on the night Emily vanished. Instead, he began examining everything that had happened during the preceding 24 hours. The 20th of October had been described as an ordinary Thursday. Daniel reviewed patrol logs, emergency calls, traffic citations, newspaper articles, and weather reports. At first, nothing appeared connected to Emily. Then, a receipt slipped from between 2 interview transcripts. It was from a gas station. The time stamp read 7:48 p.m., the 20th of October, 1994. The receipt did not belong to Emily. It belonged to Michael Carter. Michael had originally told investigators that he had spent the entire evening at home repairing farm equipment. The receipt placed him nearly 30 miles away. Ava searched the archived interviews and found another overlooked statement. A teenage cashier had reported seeing Michael arguing with someone outside the gas station. The witness could not identify the second person, so investigators had dismissed the account, but one sentence in the old statement had been underlined. The woman kept saying, "You can't hide it forever." No follow-up questions appeared in the file. The detective who handled that lead retired only months after the case went cold. Daniel stared at the statement. What had the woman believed Michael was hiding? The team next examined old telephone records connected to Emily's home. 3 calls stood out. All had been made from a payphone outside the former Miller bus depot. 6:11 p.m., 6:14 p.m., 6:19 p.m. The identity of the caller had never been established. The bus depot had since been demolished, but archival photographs survived. Near the payphone was a public bulletin board covered with community notices. One poster remained visible in the photograph. Harvest Festival, the 21st of October. Someone had circled the date with a thick black marker. Ava compared the handwriting with notes recovered from Michael's workshop during an earlier voluntary interview. The slant of the letters, the shape of the number 2, and the pressure marks appeared similar. It was not enough to prove anything, but it was another reason to continue. Late that evening, Daniel drove to Emily's abandoned house. The property had remained empty for years. Dust covered the furniture, and the rooms appeared almost exactly as relatives had left them. Family photographs filled the shelves: birthdays, Christmas celebrations, graduations, and county fairs. One photograph caught Daniel's attention. Emily stood beside Michael at a local fair. Both were smiling. In the crowd behind them stood an unfamiliar man. Only part of his body was visible, but one detail was clear: a silver pocket watch hanging from his clothing. The same man appeared to have been watching Emily long before the night she disappeared. Daniel removed the photograph carefully. Then his flashlight passed over the hallway doorframe. Pencil marks recorded the heights of children as they grew, but beneath them was a darker line of writing. It had not appeared in the original crime scene photographs. Someone had entered the abandoned house after the investigation ended. 6 words had been written on the wall: "Truth waits where memory begins." Daniel photographed the message. Someone had returned to the house, not to steal, not to damage the property, to leave an instruction. For the second time in only a few days, Daniel felt that the investigation was no longer simply following old evidence. Someone was quietly leading it forward. Back at headquarters, Daniel spread the family photographs across the evidence table. The message remained in his mind: "Truth waits where memory begins." Ava stopped at one photograph. "Look at the background." Behind the Carter family stood an old red barn. Daniel placed another photograph beside it. Different year, different season. The same barn, then another. The barn appeared repeatedly in photographs documenting major family gatherings. An address written on the back identified the property: Carter Family Orchard. The orchard had been sold nearly 20 years earlier. It had not been searched since the original investigation. By sunrise, Daniel and the task force were standing outside the abandoned property. The farmhouse had partially collapsed. Apple trees grew wild. Tall grass covered the former orchard rows. Only the red barn remained standing. Inside, broken farm equipment rested against the walls. Old hay covered the floor. Nothing initially appeared disturbed. Then Marcus used a portable ground scanner. A faint rectangular anomaly appeared beneath the center of the barn. It was slightly longer than 6 feet. Workers carefully removed the loose floorboards. Beneath them was a steel hatch concealed by decades of dirt. The lock had rusted away. Marcus lifted the door. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, and at the bottom was a room that no one had known existed. The staircase beneath the Carter family's abandoned barn led into a small underground room. Its walls were made of concrete. A single wooden desk stood in the center. 2 metal filing cabinets rested against one wall, and a bare light bulb hung from the ceiling. Someone had constructed the room long before the orchard fell into ruin. Daniel opened the first filing cabinet. Inside were dozens of envelopes. Each labeled "Property Records." The second cabinet contained something far more unusual: rows of audio cassettes. Each tape was marked with a date: the 18th of October, 1994, the 19th of October, 1994, the 20th of October, 1994, the 21st of October, 1994. Daniel removed the final cassette. The label had faded, but one handwritten instruction remained visible. Do not erase the investigators connected a portable cassette player. Static filled the underground room. Then a woman's voice emerged. It was Emily. She sounded exhausted. I can't keep pretending, a man answered, but the recording quality was poor, and most of his words were impossible to understand. Then one sentence became clear. If the truth comes out, everything changes. There was a long silence. A car door closed. Footsteps moved away. Then the recording ended. No names were mentioned. There was no confession. But the cassette proved that someone had secretly recorded conversations during the days leading up to Emily Carter's disappearance. Whatever happened on the 21st of October 1994 had begun earlier, and the remaining tapes might contain the missing pieces of Emily's final days. Because the original cassettes were old and fragile, the investigators did not play them again until forensic technicians had created digital copies. The first recording appeared ordinary at first. Rain tapped against a car windshield. A radio played quietly in the background. Emily laughed at something someone had said. Then her voice became serious. You've been following me. Several seconds passed before a man answered. I'm trying to protect you. From what? The man did not respond. The tape suddenly stopped. Daniel immediately played the second recording. It lasted nearly 20 minutes. Most of it contained road noise, the sounds of passing vehicles and a running engine. Then Emily spoke again. I know what happened in 1978. Everyone in the room became silent. The year 1978 had never appeared anywhere in the original investigation. The man answered quietly, You don't understand what you're reading. I understand enough. You should have burned it. The cassette clicked off. Daniel turned toward Ava. Find everything you can from 1978. Within an hour, the conference table was covered with archival material, newspaper articles, property records, missing person reports, old county documents. At first, nothing appeared connected to Emily Carter. Then Ava found a short article buried in a local newspaper. Its headline read, Historic Courthouse Basement, Flooded During Renovation. The report explained that a flood had damaged part of the courthouse archive in 1978. Workers temporarily relocated dozens of boxes while repairs were made. According to an inventory sheet, most of the records were eventually returned. But one collection was reported missing. It was identified only as private family probate files. The disappearance of the box received almost no public attention. Daniel stared at the article. Emily had said she knew what happened in 1978. Perhaps she had not been referring to a crime that occurred that year. Perhaps she had discovered what happened to the missing records. The investigators played the third tape. Emily sounded frightened. There was the sound of footsteps moving quickly across gravel. The recording ended before the other person responded. No names were mentioned. There were no direct accusations, but the recordings now pointed toward a disturbing conclusion. Emily had not encountered danger by accident. She had uncovered information that someone wanted to keep hidden. Daniel reached for the final tape, the 21st of October, 1994, the night Emily disappeared. He inserted it into the recorder. For nearly a minute, there was only static, wind, and the sound of a car engine. Then Emily whispered, I brought the documents with me. Paper rustled. Another vehicle approached. Its engine stopped. A car door slammed. Then the recording dissolved into harsh mechanical distortion. Ava immediately paused the audio. It isn't damaged. Daniel looked at her. What do you mean? She enlarged the digital waveform on the computer. The distortion did not appear natural. Someone had deliberately erased part of the cassette, not the entire recording, only a specific section in the middle. Exactly 4 minutes were missing. Everything recorded before that section remained intact. Everything recorded afterward had also survived. Daniel nodded toward the computer. Play the end. The tape resumed. Only one voice remained. A man was breathing heavily. Then he spoke so quietly that everyone had to lean closer. I'm sorry, Emily. A long silence followed. Footsteps moved away. A car started and drove off. The cassette clicked to its end. Daniel continued staring at the recorder. 4 minutes had been erased. Those 4 minutes may have contained the confrontation, the explanation, or the crime itself. and someone had spent decades ensuring that no one would ever hear them. Daniel finally broke the silence. Recover it. Ava nodded. It won't be easy. I didn't ask whether it would be easy. The cassette was taken to an audio laboratory where specialists examined the magnetic tape at microscopic resolution. Even when audio has been erased, weak traces can sometimes remain beneath the altered magnetic pattern. Hours passed. No one left the office. Empty coffee cups accumulated across the conference table. Outside, rain continued, striking the windows. At 2:16 a.m., Ava returned. I found something. The recovered audio was faint and fragmented. Static separated nearly every word. Daniel pressed play. Emily's voice emerged first. Only parts of her sentence could be understood. I didn't tell anyone static. Then Emily again. The papers. Another burst of noise. Courthouse. Then a different voice appeared. It was not the man heard on the earlier recordings. This man sounded older, calm, controlled. If those files become public, this family is finished. Daniel froze. There had been at least 2 men present. The original investigation had assumed Emily met only one person on the night she disappeared. The recovered audio suggested otherwise. Ava continued filtering the recording. Another fragment became audible. The words were difficult to separate, but 2 were unmistakable. Fingerprint. And then window. Someone had discussed the fingerprint on the night Emily vanished. The recording ended with a loud metallic impact. Nothing else could be recovered. Marcus reopened the original crime scene photographs. Wait. He pointed toward the driver's side window of Emily's car. The fingerprint was lifted from the outside. Daniel nodded. So, Marcus traced the print's position. If someone touched the window while it was down, and then the glass was raised, he stopped speaking. Everyone understood. Emily may not have been alone in the vehicle when the fingerprint was left. Someone could have reached across the door or leaned through the open window. The investigators requested a complete reconstruction of the scene using the original measurements, the position of the vehicle, the height of the window, the location of the fingerprint, the door angles, and the likely movements of everyone involved. The simulation took nearly an hour. Only one sequence fully matched the physical evidence. Emily had stepped out of the car. Another person stood beside the driver's door and leaned through the open window. That person's hand touched the glass. The window was then raised, preserving the fingerprint in the exact position where investigators later found it. Daniel studied the reconstruction. The print had not been left casually days earlier. It had likely been deposited during the final moments before Emily disappeared. Then Ava noticed something even more troubling, the fingerprint card. Daniel turned toward her. The evidence technician had recorded the collection time, the 22nd of October, 1994, 8:43 a.m. Ava opened the original evidence log. Another officer had photographed the car almost 2 hours before the print was collected. Daniel placed the photographs side by side. His expression changed immediately. In the first photographs, the driver's side window was halfway down. When the fingerprint was later collected, the window was completely closed. No one spoke. Someone had raised the window after police had already secured the car. Not Emily, and likely not the person who had abandoned the vehicle. Someone with access to the crime scene had altered its condition after the investigation began. Daniel examined the signatures at the bottom of the vehicle recovery log. 3 names appeared: the patrol officer, the crime scene photographer, and 1 civilian volunteer who had assisted with recovering the car. The civilian's name had appeared only once in the entire case file. He had never been interviewed again. No investigator had asked why he touched the vehicle. His name was Thomas Hale, a forgotten volunteer, a forgotten signature, and a fingerprint whose impossible timeline had waited decades for someone to notice. Thomas Hale had been dead for 19 years. Investigators confirmed his identity through a faded obituary preserved in the county archives. Thomas had worked as a tow truck operator and volunteered with the local fire department. He had never married and had no children. During the original investigation, his name appeared only once, on the evidence log for Emily Carter's vehicle. He had helped recover the car after police found it. No one had questioned him. No one had asked whether he touched the driver's side window. and no one had considered whether he might have altered the scene before the bloody fingerprint was collected. Now, decades later, Thomas had become the newest lead in Black Ridge County's oldest mystery. Daniel visited Thomas's grave before sunset. It stood beneath an old oak tree overlooking the valley. Fresh white lilies had been placed against the headstone. Someone had visited recently. There was no card and no name. The cemetery caretaker remembered seeing a visitor 3 nights earlier. "A man," he said. "Did you recognize him?" The caretaker shook his head. "He wore a long coat. His hat was pulled low. I couldn't see his face." Daniel searched the area around the grave but found nothing useful. Then Ava called from the patrol car. "You need to hear this." She had located a microcassette among several boxes of Thomas Hale's belongings. The recording began with static. Then Thomas's voice emerged. "If anyone finds this, I should have told the truth years ago." Daniel listened carefully. "I never killed Emily." A long pause followed. "But I watched the wrong man leave that road, and I stayed quiet. The tape crackled. I was afraid." Another pause. "I hid something where nobody would think to look." The recording ended. Thomas did not identify the man he had seen. He did not explain why he remained silent, and he did not reveal where he had hidden the evidence. But his statement confirmed that he knew more about Emily's disappearance than he had ever told police. Daniel reviewed Thomas's employment and volunteer records. Lone details stood out. For 26 years, Thomas had helped maintain the old county clock tower. The tower had been locked and abandoned since 2001. An hour later, Daniel climbed its narrow spiral staircase alone. Dust covered every step. The clock mechanism had stopped decades earlier. Near the top, behind the enormous clock face, Daniel noticed a loose brick. Inside the hollow space behind it was a rusted metal container. The box remained sealed and dry. Daniel carefully opened it. There was no weapon, no money, no written confession. Only a folded photograph. 5 words were written on the back in fading blue ink. "This is where it started." Daniel turned the photograph over. It showed 4 people standing together at a family picnic during the summer of 1978. Emily Carter, Michael Carter, Thomas Hale, and a 4th person. Someone had carefully removed the 4th person's face with scissors. The body remained visible, but the identity had been deliberately erased. One detail survived, a silver pocket watch hanging from the missing person's vest. Daniel recognized it immediately. It appeared to be the same watch worn by the unidentified man seen in the background of Emily's family photographs. Thomas had hidden proof that the stranger was connected not only to Emily, but also to her family and to events dating back to 1978. Forensic examination of the photograph revealed that the face had been removed with serrated cutting blades. The tool was not typical of ordinary household scissors. Investigators searched old property inventories and business records connected to the Carter family. Own former business regularly used that type of equipment, Carter Printing and Stationery. The shop had belonged to Emily's father before closing in 1981. This suggested that the photograph may not have been altered by an outsider. It may have been cut by someone with access to the Carter family's business. The investigators entered the abandoned print shop. Dust covered the machinery. Stacks of yellowed paper leaned against broken shelves, and the air smelled of old ink and damp wood. Near the rear office, Marcus found a steel filing cabinet with a rusted lock. They forced it open. Inside were customer ledgers, receipts, printing orders, and family documents. At the bottom was a thin brown envelope marked with a date. The 18th of July, 1978. Daniel opened it carefully. Inside was an original photographic negative. It showed the same picnic scene, but this version had not been damaged. The 4th person's face remained intact. He appeared to be a man in his early 40s, with dark hair and a calm expression. The silver pocket watch hung from his vest. A name had been written across the envelope, Richard Vale. No one on the investigative team recognized it. Ava searched the county's records. No driver's license, no voter registration, no military record, no local property file. According to the available records, Richard Vale had never officially existed in Black Ridge County, yet the photographs proved that he had known the Carter family. A second message had been hidden beneath the envelope flap. "If this photograph is ever found, "Look where the river changes direction." The note carried no signature and offered no explanation. Marcus opened a county map. Hollow Creek made an unusually sharp bend north of the old stone bridge. It was the only location where the river changed direction by almost 90 degrees by sunset. The task force had reached the muddy riverbank. Tall reeds covered much of the shoreline. Daniel walked along the water until he noticed something metallic beneath the surface, near the remains of an old wooden dock. Divers entered the creek. Minutes later, they emerged carrying a small steel strongbox wrapped in heavy chain. The metal was badly corroded, but the container remained closed. Investigators broke the lock. Inside was a bundle of documents protected by waxed cloth. A folded note rested on top. "Everything begins with this file." The paper had yellowed, but the message remained legible. "If these documents have finally been opened, then someone refused to let the truth disappear. Read everything before making a decision. Once these names become public, Black Ridge County will never remember its history the same way again." There was no date, no signature, only the records beneath it. The bundle contained birth certificates, property transfers, handwritten wills, survey maps, and courthouse documents from the late 1970s. Own record carried a stamp, void. Not for public record, it described a dispute over several hundred acres surrounding Hollow Creek. At first, the disagreement appeared to be an ordinary property case. Then Daniel found a sworn statement signed by 4 witnesses: Emily Carter's father, Thomas Hale, Richard Vale, and Sheriff Benjamin Lawson. Daniel stared at the final signature. Lawson had signed the document 16 years before Emily disappeared. He later became the sheriff responsible for overseeing her investigation. The property dispute had apparently never reached court. No newspaper had reported it. No surviving county record mentioned it. Someone had removed the entire proceeding from the official archive. A folded map slipped from between the pages. A location had been circled in red pencil: an abandoned stone mill beside Hollow Creek. The mill had burned in 1985. The missing courthouse records, the property dispute, Richard Vale, Thomas Hale, and Sheriff Lawson, now all appeared connected to the same place. Before the team could finish reviewing the documents, Daniel received a call from an unknown number. The voice spoke quietly. "You opened the wrong box." Daniel said nothing. "You still have time." The caller paused. "If you go to the mill, don't go underground." The line disconnected. There was no explanation, no demand. Only a warning. Daniel looked at the old map spread across the table for decades. The mill had been regarded as nothing more than a burned foundation hidden in the woods. Now someone who knew about the missing records was trying to keep investigators away from it. Daniel folded the map. "We leave at first light." Whatever Emily had discovered, and whatever Richard Vale had tried to preserve, the next part of the truth appeared to be waiting beneath the ruins of the old mill. The convoy reached the ruins of the old mill shortly after sunrise. Mist drifted across Hollow Creek, wrapping the burned stone structure in pale gray fog. From a distance, the ruins looked less like a building and more like the skeleton of something that had refused to disappear. Blackened walls stood against the morning sky. Broken windows stared out like empty eyes. Although nearly 4 decades had passed since the fire, local residents still avoided the property. Hunters refused to camp nearby, and teenagers who dared one another to enter rarely stayed for long. Daniel ignored the stories. Legends did not matter, evidence did. Marcus unfolded the survey map recovered from the strongbox. The red circle marked the northern corner of the mill, where a collapsed storage room had once stood. Thick vines covered the cracked foundation. The team spent nearly half an hour removing loose bricks before Ava noticed something unusual. "These stones aren't original." She brushed away the mud. The mortar beneath them was cleaner than the surrounding structure. Someone had rebuilt part of the wall years after the fire. Daniel tapped the stones with the handle of his flashlight. Most produced a solid sound. The final block returned a hollow echo. Marcus inserted a pry bar into the narrow gap. With a heavy groan, the false wall shifted inward. Cold air rushed from the darkness beyond. Behind it was a narrow underground passage. Unlike the burned ruins above, the tunnel showed almost no fire damage. Its concrete walls remained intact, and old electrical conduits ran along the ceiling. Daniel swept his flashlight across the floor. There were footprints, 2 separate sets. Zone appeared to be only a few days old. Someone had entered the tunnel recently. The investigators moved carefully through the corridor. Every sound echoed underground. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness. After nearly 200 feet, the passage opened into a circular chamber. Metal shelves lined the walls. Most were empty, but several still held weathered boxes marked with faded county inventory numbers. Daniel opened the nearest container. Inside were tax records, land surveys, and other routine documents. Nothing explained why they had been hidden beneath a burned mill. Then Ava found a locked cabinet in the corner. Marcus broke the corroded latch. Inside was a single leather binder. Its cover displayed an embossed county seal but no title. Daniel opened it. The first pages contained dozens of typed names: business owners, judges, teachers, deputies, and council members. Beside each name was a handwritten notation. Some read, interviewed others. Cleared a smaller number carried a more troubling label. Never located, Daniel stopped at one familiar name, Richard Vale. Written beside it in red ink were the words, "Identity unconfirmed." Ava frowned. What does that mean? Daniel turned the page. A black and white photograph had been attached inside. Richard Vale stood beside members of the Carter family, exactly as he had in the recovered negative, but another person stood in the background. Marcus recognized him. That's Sheriff Lawson. The same sheriff who had signed the missing property documents, the same sheriff who later supervised the investigation into Emily Carter's disappearance, the same sheriff who officially declared that case had reached a dead end. The binder was not an official case file. It appeared to be someone's private investigation. Its unknown author had spent years connecting events that reached back long before Emily vanished: disputed land deeds, anonymous telephone calls, missing courthouse documents, unrecorded meetings, and unexplained changes to county property records. No single entry proved a crime. Together, however, they formed a pattern that someone had worked carefully to preserve. Near the back of the binder, one page had been folded inward. Daniel opened it. Only one sentence appeared in the center: "Do not mistake coincidence for innocence." Before anyone could examine the remaining pages, a sharp metallic sound echoed from deeper inside the tunnel. Everyone froze. Daniel switched off his flashlight. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Another noise followed footsteps. Slow and measured. They were not approaching. They were retreating. Someone else was underground. The team waited until the footsteps faded. When Daniel turned the lights back on, something new rested on the table: a clean sheet of paper. No one had seen anyone enter the chamber. Written across it was a single line: "You're finally asking the right questions." The ink was still wet. Whoever had left the note could not have been far away. Daniel divided the team. No one goes alone. Marcus examined the fresh footprints. They led into a narrow corridor branching away from the main chamber. The passage curved before ending at a heavy steel door. It was unlocked. Beyond, it was a small office. Unlike the rest of the underground complex, this room had been occupied recently. A camping lantern sat on the desk. Its surface was still warm. There was an empty coffee cup and a neatly folded sleeping bag. Simone had been living there for days. Maps covered the desk. There were newspaper clippings and photocopies from Emily Carter's case file. Handwritten notes filled the margins. One sentence appeared repeatedly: "Don't trust the timeline." Ava opened a battered filing box beneath the desk. Inside were audio cassettes identical to those recovered beneath the orchard. But these tapes carried recent dates. Someone had been documenting the reopened investigation. Daniel picked up the newest cassette. Its label read, Day 12. He pressed play. A tired male voice emerged. They reopened the fingerprint. Static interrupted the recording. "They're moving faster than expected." A pause followed. Then the voice continued. "If Mercer reaches the mill, he'll find the body." Daniel's expression hardened. The recording continued. "That has to happen." The tape ended. Marcus looked toward him. "Whoever made this wanted us to come here." A large map of Black Ridge County hung above the desk. Colored pins marked every important location in the investigation: Emily's house, Hollow Creek, the Carter orchard, the courthouse, the abandoned print shop, the cemetery, and the mill. Strings connected almost all of them. Only one location remained isolated in the upper corner of the map. A black circle surrounded it. Ava checked the coordinates against an older survey. Eagle Ridge Lookout. The fire tower had been abandoned since the late 1980s after lightning damaged the structure. Daniel stared at the mark. Every previous location had revealed another piece of the mystery. This one had been kept separate, almost protected. Behind a loose plywood panel, Marcus discovered a narrow locker. Inside hung a dark raincoat. Wet mud still clung to the boots beneath it. A notebook rested on the shelf. The final page had been written only hours earlier. If you're reading this, I was too late. The truth was never hidden inside one murder. Emily discovered that herself. Follow the map. Leave everything else behind. There was no name, no signature. Daniel closed the notebook. Whoever was guiding the investigation did not appear to be trying to bury the truth. They were leading the team toward it. The investigators reached Eagle Ridge Lookout as a storm approached the mountain. Fresh tire tracks led to the tower and then disappeared back down the road. Marcus examined them. One vehicle, less than 3 hours ago. They climbed the rusted staircase. At the top, the observation room appeared nearly empty. There was a folding chair, a lantern, and a portable radio with its batteries removed. Beneath the wooden floor, Ava found a narrow steel tube. Inside were 3 items: a rolled topographic map, a leather notebook, and a Polaroid photograph. The photograph showed Hollow Creek from above. A small white X marked the bend where investigators had recovered the chained strongbox. The map contained dozens of handwritten coordinates. Every location the team had already searched had been crossed out in black ink. Only one remained untouched. Pine Hollow Quarry. The quarry had closed in the early 1980s after a controlled explosion supposedly collapsed part of its western wall. Ava opened the notebook. The first entry read, "Every clue I left was meant to slow you down. I needed time to verify what Emily discovered before anyone else reached it." Another entry followed. "I trusted the wrong witness in 1994. Then, the fingerprint mattered, but not because it identified a killer. It proved that someone rewrote the official timeline. The handwriting became increasingly unsteady near the final pages. The last legible instruction read, "Don't waste time searching for me. Go to Pine Hollow Quarry. The answer isn't buried beneath the ground. It is hidden inside what everyone believes was destroyed." A sudden burst of static came from the portable radio. Everyone turned toward it. The batteries had been removed. For only a second, a voice emerged from the speaker, "Too late." Then silence returned. The road to Pine Hollow Quarry twisted through dense forest. By late afternoon, the abandoned site emerged from the fog. Towering granite walls surrounded a vast basin filled with rainwater. Rusted conveyors leaned at unnatural angles, and damaged concrete structures stood like monuments to another era. According to official reports, the quarry had been abandoned after a major controlled blast in 1982. The western excavation wall had supposedly collapsed. Several buildings were demolished, and engineers declared the area unsafe. Yet someone had visited recently. Near Processing Building 3, Marcus found a fresh footprint preserved in wet clay. There were no corresponding tracks leading back out. Inside the ruined building, dust covered nearly every surface except for one narrow path. Simone had swept it clean. The trail passed through collapsed machinery and ended at an enormous pile of rock where the western wall had supposedly fallen. Marcus examined the exposed stone. This wasn't a natural collapse. He uncovered straight drill marks beneath the dust, controlled demolition. Daniel nodded. "So the reports were right." "No," Marcus replied. "They demolished the entrance. The rubble had not destroyed the entire building. It had sealed a service tunnel. A portable scanner revealed a long, empty space beyond the rocks. Heavy equipment arrived before sunset. For nearly 2 hours, workers carefully removed unstable debris. Eventually, they opened a narrow gap. Cold air moved through it, carrying the faint smells of metal, oil, and concrete. The tunnel beyond remained intact. Old emergency lights lined the walls. Painted arrows pointed deeper underground. Fresh footprints crossed the dust. the same tread pattern found beneath the mill. The corridor ended at an enormous reinforced steel door. Faded black lettering covered its surface. Archive storage, Daniel frowned. A quarry doesn't need an archive. Marcus turned the manual release wheel. The bolts retracted with a heavy metallic sound. The team pulled the door open. Dust spilled into the corridor. When the air cleared, their flashlight beams illuminated row after row of shelving. Hundreds of aisles extended into the darkness. Cardboard boxes, film canisters, microfilm cabinets, engineering drawings, survey maps, audio recordings. Everything was organized. Nothing had burned. Nothing had been destroyed. The records everyone believed had vanished during the 1982 explosion had been preserved underground. Daniel walked between the shelves. The boxes carried county inventory numbers matching the courthouse records reported missing in 1978. The archive had never disappeared. It had been moved and concealed. Inside a wooden catalog cabinet, the investigators found thousands of index cards. Owen immediately caught Daniel's attention. Carter, Emily, instead of a file number, the card contained an instruction. See Vale Collection. They located the corresponding entry, Vale, Richard Shelf, B, -17, Cabinet 4. Drawer 2. Inside that drawer was a thick, leather-bound journal wrapped in dark cloth. There was no official seal, no evidence label, only a handwritten warning. Private investigation. Do not file every hidden room, every cassette, every anonymous message, every recovered photograph, and every altered record had led to this journal. Daniel untied the cloth and opened the cover. On the first page, written in neat blue ink, was a single sentence. If you are reading this, then Emily reached the same conclusion I did, and that means we both ran out of time. Daniel did not immediately turn the page. For decades, the investigation had revolved around a missing woman, an altered crime scene, an erased identity, and a fingerprint that should not have survived. No, the team had reached a document written by the mysterious man whose existence someone had tried to remove from county history. Whatever Richard Vale had discovered began as a dispute over land. But by the time Emily Carter became involved, the secret had already been protected for more than 16 years. Daniel did not turn the page immediately. The sentence on the opening page of Richard Vale's journal seemed to carry the weight of everything the investigators had uncovered. If you are reading this, then Emily reached the same conclusion I did, and that means we both ran out of time. For 38 years, the case had revolved around a missing woman, an altered timeline, a forgotten fingerprint, and a man whose identity had been removed from photographs and official records. Now the investigators were holding Richard Vale's private account. Ava positioned portable lights around the underground archive. Rain struck the abandoned quarry above them. Daniel carefully turned the page. The first entry was dated the 14th of January, 1978. Richard explained that he had initially accepted what appeared to be an ordinary property dispute. Two neighboring families claimed ownership of the same land. There were missing deeds, conflicting surveys, and contradictory legal documents. But Richard quickly discovered that the disagreement was not ordinary. Every official record contradicts another. The courthouse records do not match the tax office. The tax office does not match the survey department. The survey department does not match the original land grants. Someone had apparently altered county records long before Richard began investigating. Several pages later, his neat handwriting became hurried. I made copies. If anything happens to me, never trust a single archive. Always compare 3 independent records. Daniel looked around the hidden facility. That explained why Richard had scattered information across so many locations: the orchard, the mill, the clock tower, the courthouse records, the quarry. No single archive contained the entire story. If one collection disappeared, another might survive. If one investigator gave up, someone else could still follow the remaining clues. A hand-drawn map slipped from between the journal's pages. It showed Black Ridge County as it had appeared during the early 20th century. Several roads no longer existed. Entire neighborhoods had disappeared from modern maps. Near Hollow Creek, Richard had circled a building labeled County Records. Annex Daniel had never heard of it. Marcus checked the historical survey. The annex had supposedly burned down in 1959. Richard had written beneath the map, "Everyone believes the annex was destroyed." It wasn't. Only the visible structure burned. Once again, something the county believed had disappeared may only have been concealed. The journal next described a young county clerk named Eleanor Brooks. While organizing probate files, Eleanor discovered inconsistencies in official documents. She believed someone inside the county government had been quietly replacing original records with altered copies over many years. Richard initially doubted her theory. Then she showed him 3 official copies of the same notarized deed. All carried the same date, but each contained a different signature. Only one could have been authentic. The mystery was no longer about one incorrect property record. It involved decades of altered paperwork. Another document fell from the journal. It was a newspaper clipping with the headline, "Local archivist dies in house. Fire." The archivist was Eleanor Brooks. The fire had been ruled accidental. The article stated that no official files were missing. Richard had underlined that sentence in red and written 2 words beside it. False report. Daniel slowly folded the clipping. The deeper the investigators looked, the less Emily's disappearance resembled an isolated crime. She had entered a mystery that had begun years before she was born. Richard's later entries revealed that he had known Emily personally. He wrote that she had begun asking questions about inconsistent historical records. She was not searching for a murder. She was helping prepare educational materials for school children when she noticed that 2 official maps placed the same bridge in different locations. So an innocent question led to another, then another. Richard recognized the pattern immediately. It was the same curiosity that had drawn Eleanor Brooks into the records years earlier, and it was the same curiosity that had consumed his own life. He warned Emily to walk away. According to Richard, she smiled and replied that truth mattered more than comfort. One of the final pages contained a list of 5 locations. Far had been crossed out: the orchard, the mill, the lookout tower, the Quarry archive. Only one remained: St. Gabriel's train tunnel beside it. Richard had written, "If you have found every other archive, do not open the last one alone." St. Gabriel's tunnel had been closed since 1968 after a reported collapse. The official story claimed that approximately 600 feet of the passage had been destroyed, but the demolition records showed that far less explosive material had been used than would have been required for such extensive damage. The collapse may have been exaggerated or deliberately staged. The following morning, the investigators traveled north through dense forest. The abandoned railway gradually disappeared beneath weeds and fallen trees. Eventually, they reached the eastern entrance. A massive concrete barrier blocked the tunnel. Warning signs covered its surface: danger, unstable rock. No entry but a narrow maintenance door had been installed in the concrete. The padlock was modern. Marcus examined it, replaced within the last year. Someone was still visiting the supposedly abandoned tunnel. Ava found fresh boot prints nearby. They matched the tread pattern investigators had followed from the mill and the quarry. Daniel cut the lock. Cold air rushed through the doorway. The team entered. For nearly half a mile, the tunnel appeared abandoned. Water dripped from the ceiling. The walls were blackened by decades of locomotive smoke. Then Daniel noticed new electrical wiring running along one side. It led to a modern utility cabinet containing circuit breakers, batteries, and maintenance records. The latest inspection had occurred only 3 weeks earlier. There was no company name, no government agency, no signature. The tunnel was not abandoned. Someone had been maintaining it in secret. Further inside, the corridor divided into several passages. One had collapsed. A second was blocked by a locked gate. The third remained open. A hand-painted wooden sign hung above it. The wording was faded and difficult to read. The passage descended and ended at a reinforced wooden door. Pinned to the front was a freshly written note. "You finally arrived before I disappeared." Someone had continued guiding the investigators. Inside the older section of the railway tunnel, Daniel noticed 3 short lines carved into the wall. The same symbol had appeared at the orchard, the mill, and the quarry. Beneath it was a small arrow pointing toward a stone wall. The wall sounded hollow. Several stones carried faint numbers: 1, 3, 5, and 7. The team eventually realized that the numbers represented a sequence. They pressed the stones in the correct order. A mechanical lock released. Part of the wall moved inward. At the bottom of the stairs stood a steel door engraved with the words, County Historical Repository, a brass keyhole was built into the lock. Daniel remembered a numbered key recovered earlier in the investigation. The key fit. When he turned it, the locking bolts retracted. Warm, conditioned air drifted from inside. The repository looked nothing like an abandoned storage room. The lights were still working. Shelves were neatly organized. Almost no dust covered the floor. A clock ticked on the far wall. Beside an open ledger sat a ceramic cup of coffee. Steam still rose from it. Someone had been there only minutes earlier. Then a calm voice spoke from beyond the shelves. "I wondered how long it would take you." An elderly man stepped into view. He had silver hair, wore a dark coat, and carried another leather-bound journal. Daniel asked for his name. The man identified himself only as Arthur. The original transcript does not clearly preserve his full name. Arthur told them that Richard Vail had deliberately kept him out of the official records. Then, he revealed something far more important. I was the last person to see Richard alive. Arthur removed a storage box from one of the shelves. Inside were dozens of reel-to-reel recordings. The labels carried dates beginning in 1978 and continuing through the following years. "These are interviews," Arthur explained. "With whom?" Daniel asked. "With everyone who remembered the truth before it was forgotten." The first reel was labeled Interview 1, Eleanor Brooks. Daniel looked at him. "She died," Arthur shook his head. "That is what the newspaper printed." He gestured toward the surrounding archive. They printed many things. The repository was not simply an evidence room. It contained maps, photographs, engineering records, personal diaries, community newsletters, family letters, and oral histories. Arthur described it as something different. It is a memory. Richard believed that history disappeared one person at a time, so he recorded everything. Children describing old festivals, teachers remembering demolished buildings, railroad workers explaining why documents had been moved during renovations, residents recalling small events that had never appeared in official reports. Individually, the memories seemed unimportant. Together, they reconstructed a town that no longer existed. Richard had written, "If one witness forgets, another still remembers. If one document burns, another survives. Truth rarely dies all at once." That was why the records had been separated and hidden in different places. Richard wanted to ensure that forgetting would never be complete. Arthur placed several journals on the table. They represented the beginning of Richard's investigation and the years that followed. Then he removed one final volume. Its cover was blank. There was no title and no author's name. Arthur explained that the journal had never been opened. "Why?" Daniel asked. Arthur looked at him. "Because whoever reads it becomes responsible for deciding which memories deserve to survive." Daniel placed his hand on the cover. He did not open it immediately. Arthur explained that Richard had distinguished between preserving facts and preserving people. Dates, maps, signatures, and photographs could survive inside boxes, but people did not live inside boxes. They lived inside stories. The final journal was not a case file. It was Richard's explanation. Daniel untied the faded ribbon. The handwriting inside was calm and deliberate. There were no hurried corrections or crossed out sentences. The opening passage read, "Many people will expect this journal to identify a villain. They will expect one hidden mastermind and one perfect explanation. Life almost never grants such comfort." According to Richard, the mystery had not begun with one carefully planned crime. It began through ordinary decisions. A clerk copied the wrong document. A surveyor trusted an outdated map. A judge signed papers without checking the originals. A family chose silence rather than embarrassment. Years became decades. Small mistakes accumulated until no one remembered where the first mistake had occurred. The truth had not been erased in a single act. It had gradually disappeared beneath errors, fear, silence, and repeated attempts to protect reputations. Richard's explanation did not identify one person as the cause of everything, nor did it provide a complete account of what ultimately happened to Emily. The source manuscript itself does not resolve her disappearance with a confirmed body, confession, or criminal conviction. Instead, the journal reframed the investigation. Emily had not begun by pursuing a murderer. She had been teaching local history. A faded newspaper photograph showed her standing outside Black Ridge Elementary School during a history fair, holding a display board covered with copies of county maps. Beneath the image, Richard had written, "She believed history belonged to everyone." At the far end of the repository stood a small wooden cabinet. Arthur gave Daniel a brass key he had carried for 27 years. The key opened the cabinet. Inside were no police reports, no weapons, no final confession. There were only carefully arranged envelopes. Each was labeled with a year. The dates continued far beyond Richard's lifetime and beyond Emily's disappearance. Arthur explained that the envelopes contained letters written by people who refused to let Black Ridge County be remembered only for its tragedies. Every generation had been asked to leave something behind: family memories, descriptions of local traditions, stories about teachers, neighbors, churches, bridges, and homes. Ordinary lives that official history might otherwise forget. After decades spent following fingerprints, erased photographs, missing records, anonymous recordings, and hidden tunnels, Daniel had expected to find one final answer. Instead, he found a collection of voices. The last archive did not contain a simple confession. It preserved the humanity of a town whose history had been rewritten, misplaced, and nearly forgotten. And while the exact truth of Emily Carter's disappearance remained incomplete, Richard Vail's purpose finally became clear. He had not created the trail merely to solve a murder. He created it so that no person, no document, and no memory could ever be erased completely.